welcome everyone. There's 31 participants. That's really terrific. This is a Labor Academy event, one of an occasional series. The topic is, generally speaking, hate speech. But what I might do is firstly introduce myself. I'm Peter Fitzgerald. I head the Justice and Democracy Policy Committee. A number of the members of my committee are here tonight. I'll acknowledge Jamie and Kate Jackson and Harvey and Robert Johnson. But we might begin with an acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of the land. Where I am, it's the Wurundjeri Wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. I pay respects to elders past, present, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Does anyone like to do a statement of Labor values? Because it might be a nice warm-up to the whole topic of hate speech. Does anyone have it handy?
Does Sunny Stephen, can I suggest Sunny? Because she reads it best to Sunny. Can you?
Please, Sunny, if you can go off mute and if you can reach a copy of the statement of Labor values.
She does the best rendition I've heard.
Having trouble, right. I was having a bit of trouble getting myself off audio. 2 seconds while I grab my Labor values. Thank you for this opportunity. Victorian Labor values achieving social justice, fairness, inclusion and equality. We value honesty, integrity and ensuring that the party is a safe, inclusive and respectful environment. The party is a collective cause and larger than any individual. We are proud of our deep roots and history in the Labor movement. We support workers organising in union to achieve justice, fairness and equity. Our members, volunteers and supporters are our greatest assets. Prejudice and discrimination, including ageism, which I'm going for this year, sexism, racism, ableism, homophobia and transphobia have no place in our party. We celebrate the diversity of our party. We support one another because we are stronger together. This is Labor. Thank you.
Here, and thanks, Sunny. Some nice reminders in all of that. So we are explicitly for diversity. We're for inclusion. We're against racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, etc. However, our context has never been worse. Or maybe it's been worse, but it's at a low ebb. Our public discourse is poor. Hate speech is a real thing. I might pass on a couple of bits of received wisdom and then jump into what the Justice and Democracy Policy Committee is about and what we're trying to do. But the first piece of received wisdom is from the Declaration of Human Rights. It says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. So this is Article number 1. It's actually, in my opinion, quite interesting for the difference between rights and other things. So the right is human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So whatever rights we have them equally. We also have rights and a right to dignity, okay? The second bit is also interesting. They, being the people, are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. I'm thinking that this could be the missing piece of the equation. We've lost whatever spirit of brotherhood might have enabled us to all have free speech. So if we had free speech and respect, free speech and inclusion, free speech and acceptance of the equality of others and their rights, we would not be in the same position that we're at today in public discourse. And so we have from our federal and state governments we've got a Royal Commission into anti-Semitism. We've got legislation in Canberra which was called hate speech legislation, in Victoria, we had the Anti-Vilification Act. And so I might talk about some of that in the context of the work of the Justice and Democracy Policy Committee. So we're a policy committee of the party. We're appointed or actually elected by members of the state conference. So we're actually a piece of machinery of the state conference. We give recommendations back to state conference. Our work at the moment is very busy on giving feedback to the executive government and the party on the election platform for the election in November. And so we have lots of points of difference with the government about human rights compliance, particularly imprisoning 12 and 13-year-olds, and the treatment of police in relation to 10 and 11-year-olds. But we have a set of recommendations that conference has accepted about the Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, which is we want a proper review of the Charter of Human Rights in terms of how it's working, how it might be changed. We want it extended and expanded out to include a range of other rights than just civil and political rights, but also include rights such as the right to housing, but also the rights of traditional owners of the land, but also the rights of children. So there's a set of things on which your very progressive state does not comply with international covenants. And so we want to fix that up. The other things that we are doing is, the anti-vilification bill passed has created some new offences. So I might ask Josh about that when he's done his presentation. But in addition to criminal sanctions, there's also a new regime of civil remedies. And we've been encouraging the government to work on, really the Commission working on enforceable undertakings. So if there is a particularly, e.g., troublesome journalist who's repeatedly racist, sexist, anti-immigration, blah, 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 they might be brought to account by giving an enforceable undertaking that they won't intentionally vilify particular races. Whether this can be applied to one nation, so can one say all Muslims are bad? Can you say that without breaching one of the new laws? That's a question I'll put to Josh a bit later. So we are actively trying to get the state government to promise a bit more in relation to their state election platform. Branch members will see a full copy of that before the state conference is held in the third week of May. We hope to have a set of interactions with the ministers. Sorry, we are having interactions with the ministers' offices at the moment on I'm going to say 101 topics. Not quite true, probably 10 or 20 topics. But if I can just mention one we're specifically seeking, we think that there's a need to criminalise intimidatory conduct at polling booths. So those of us in the inner city witnessed various bits of behaviour at the last federal election, some by the Brethren group, others by not even party political people who were funded by the Advance group, who yelled at people, sought to intimidate them. This is American-style election disruption. We're saying that there probably is a need to assert a bit more authority over the space of election polling, and that that's a sort of, it's a line in the sand, really. If we can't defend our polling booths, then our democracy really is at stake. But if I can just explore a little bit more the problems that we have, but if I can say a couple of bits about the Royal Commission. The Royal Commission has kicked off with some letters patent, which I'll just put in the chat function. But one of the extract is that the government recognises that strengthening the national consensus in support of democracy, freedom and the rule of law, bracket social cohesion, provides the strongest defence against anti-Semitism and other forms of religious and ideologically motivated extremism. That's a set of words that is a nice reminder as to how the federal government's thinking. So it's saying that we need to work on the national consensus at a time when we seem not to have a national consensus about things such as multiculturalism, immigration, inclusion, Aboriginal recognition, moderation of speech. So can a political leader come out and say all Muslims are bad? It's very Trumpish in its genesis. So Trump's been around for almost ever. So I lived in New York 35 years ago, and Trump was a person known to the New Yorkers as a person not to be trusted at all, but the rest of the country seemed to then vote for him. But his most specific stuff has been in the last 10 years. And so here's the first recent example of a national figure who's prepared to step forward and say, I'm a white nationalist and I don't like immigration, I don't like internationalism, I don't like any of this inclusion stuff, I don't like persons of colour. Those are each and every one an attack on democracy if we define democracy as really that opening premise, that all people are equal and people have equal rights, which is, by the way, a restatement of the preamble that Thomas Jefferson put together in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And so what used to be self-evident is now a divisive point. And as Josh will tell us, the trend to shut people up is everywhere. And so Josh has written a book on working for the brand, where repeatedly people are being told that they can't in their own time talk about anything that might be considered political. This is, so it's not just corporate, it's also radio commentators, writers being cancelled, and then writers' festivals being cancelled. In my own extended family, it's the new norm that there are some topics that can't be spoken about. I saw a survey for last Thanksgiving in the US. 40% of families were agreeing not to talk about politics. So, and that's because of the world we live in. But we must talk about politics, and we as Labor Party members, we self-define as being in the business of self-expression via political expression in the interests of the common good. Once we're asked to not do that, then we're not living in a democracy. So I'm just going to say, I did want to put the Victorian context in. So the Victorian anti-vilification bill also has some fabulous received wisdom to it, and they were able to get the opposition to sign off on this, that vilification harms social cohesion through its inherent divisiveness and perpetuates the unequal distribution of power. Vilifying conduct is contrary to democratic values because of its effect on the people who are subjected to it. It diminishes their dignity, sense of self-worth, and belonging to their community, and can cause profound physical and psychological harm. It also reduces their ability to contribute to and participate in all social, political, economic aspects of society as equals, thus reducing the benefit the diversity brings to the community. It's the intention of the Victorian Parliament to enact a law for its people that respects the inherent dignity of all of us and promotes our equal participation in public life. I think it's a fabulous statement to have got the whole Parliament to agree that, because it is a restatement of democratic values, and in every sense, this is what we are fighting to protect. And we're fighting to protect against one nation that now have 25% support. But I say to the Liberal and the Nationals, the coalition frenemies, we have noticed that you're chasing One Nation to do preference deals. So they're looking to have some kind of extended coalition, Liberal, National, and One Nation, sort of in brackets. And so they really have to be called on that. I'm going to finish just in a second, and I've already run over time. So I'm just going to say where the Justice and Democracy Policy Committee got in the most recent set of comments was two things. Most recent meeting, Harvey, who's here, raised the issue of a group of Jewish gay men in the Sydney Mardi Gras pulling out because of fearfulness. In Melbourne, we had a gay pride march in Fitzroy. So I'm a Fitzroy person. And there were protests against police presence at the gay march. And so police might be the solution or the problem. But we did kind of say, this is kind of tricky and requires delicate thought. But we want to side with the vulnerable, and we do want to pay attention to those issues that are in the Victorian Parliament about dignity and feeling lesser by virtue of hate speech. And so our resolution of the committee the other day, noting that the Commonwealth hate speech has been enacted ahead of public consultation and outcomes of the Royal Commission, we urge Labor members to stand together to campaign for responses to racism that prioritise education, social cohesion, equity, dialogue, and equal protection under the law, and protect freedom of belief, speech, and democratic dissent for all communities. So not just anti-Semitism, but also Islamophobia, transphobia, whatever the phobia is of the day. And so we're saying, look, let's pay more attention. At the prompting partly of Jamie Gardiner, let's pay attention to feeling and vulnerability, particularly entrenched vulnerability, and sort of let's do better. There's more to be done. So Josh is going to talk to us about some of the legal aspects. I'm hoping that Janet and Maureen can talk to us about the education side. But if there's any questions for me, I'll take them now. Otherwise, I'm going to jump over to Josh. Any questions at this point? We'll put our hands up as a show of good behaviour. No? Okay. Let's jump into.
Wait. Sorry. Yes.
Ned.
Hello. Thank you, Peter. I was just wondering if you knew about the Welsh law, which is to make it illegal for politicians to lie. There's the model isn't completely finished yet, but I think it's the best solution.
Okay. Thank you for that. And so you think lies are at the genesis of the problems? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, because saying something like all Muslims are bad is a lie. Saying something like climate change isn't real is a lie. And I think it should be illegal for politicians to do those kind of things.
Yep. Okay. We could put it under the bracket of misconduct in public office and put it under the Prince Andrew clause. Okay. Janet, you're going to introduce Josh?
Yes, it's a great pleasure to introduce Josh Bornstein, who is really one of the legal heroes of the Labor movement. Was in great eternal fame in the film about the maritime strike, but he's been a consistent and very skillful warrior for human rights and for industrial rights all his career, and he's a very serious thinker about society and politics. So his book, Working for the Brand, I completely recommend to everyone. It's a very deep book about being Labor and being left, but written with great humanity and great feeling. So it's my pleasure to introduce Josh, who's been fighting the good fight for a very long time and doesn't have it easy. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to participate tonight. I might start before I dive into matters legal, and I won't do that in too much detail because it can get tedious. just respond to some of the issues that Peter raised in opening and just give you some initial observations. One is that contest about free speech is a permanent feature of our lives. It goes in waves, but there's very rarely a period where there's always a consensus about free speech. Two, speech has never really been free because since the time of Methuselah, there's always been a recognition that some forms of speech cause harm. And really post our understanding of free speech owes a lot to the Enlightenment period, where the notion of the harm principle was formulated by J.S. Mill, and we came to recognise that parliaments could regulate speech where there was a requisite harm. And so in Australia, we have many, many statutes that regulate speech, even about companies lying about their products, deceptive and misleading conduct, sexual harassment cases that regulate speech, bullying cases regulate speech. There's regulation about trademarks and particular words you can or can't use. There's treason, there's defamation, there's civil order offences. So there's a raft of laws that regulate our speech. We don't think about it or talk about very much, but it's really important to recognise that speech has never been absolutely free and probably never will be. When we get to talk about hate speech, there are different conceptions of hate speech, but I include within the notion of hate speech particularly vilification. Racial vilification is foremost in my mind when I think about hate speech. And we have had laws about racism, for example, for decades. And you might recall when Peter referred to journalists that Andrew Bolt was sued about a decade ago for racist, anti-Aboriginal diatribes in some of his articles, and that prompted a big backlash, and Tony Abbott trying to change the law to weaken anti-racism laws. All the people who now supported the right to be a bigot are now strongly backing the more right-wing parts of the Jewish community in seeking greater censorship. So they've flipped position completely. The Australian is now a campaigner for stronger racism laws, but only in respect of anti-Semitism. And when you come to Pauline Hanson's statement about all Muslims being bad, that is classic hate speech. If it's not unlawful, it should be. The complexity with that is under the federal law, Muslims are not recognised as a race under the Race Discrimination Act, but Jews are. That's a problem. And so there's no... She should have been sued for that already, but because it's legally complicated, it may breach some certain state laws, but it doesn't breach the Race Discrimination Act. Hanson hasn't been sued. One of the reasons we focus so strongly about hate speech is the harm it is linked to violence, it's linked to psychological harm, and it robs people of dignity. So the various forms of prescription about racism and hate speech and other forms of regulation focus on those sorts of harms. My book addressed another form of censorship, which really reflects the growth in power of corporations during and since the neoliberal era, in which power was transferred away from consumers, from workers, from the state in favour of corporations. And one of the abuses that I argue that corporations now routinely engage in is the repressive anti-democratic censorship of employees. And that's been buttressed in the social media era, when everybody now can express their views fairly readily on social media. And as that's occurred, corporations have become more sensitive about protecting their brand and more repressive in essentially saying to all of their employees, if you come to work for us, you're not allowed to say or do anything that's controversial. Controversy, disagreement, debate, even dissent is, I would argue, at the heart of democracy. And so private organisations essentially banning those activities is, in my view, deeply, deeply anti-democratic. What's even more pernicious is that corporate conduct has infiltrated universities and other institutions, and so we see the same issues, the same corporate brand management techniques have infected public institutions like universities, the ABC. I sued the ABC on behalf of Antoinette Lattouf about a case like this. Universities, there's been lots of cases along these lines. And as arts festivals and cultural organisations sought sponsorship and corporate executives on their boards, we've seen in the last few years a wave of terrible censorship, largely directed at pro-Palestinian activism. And so that sort of malaise has infected, which is really strong in the private sector, has infected many other institutions. The other thing I want to say before I dive into the law is this. One of the problems in this age of rising authoritarianism and retreat from democracy, which we like to think in Australia we're not going to suffer, is that institutions that we would look to for support of democracy are being diminished and weakened. When the debate about Tony Abbott's proposed law, right to be a bigot law, was underway, the Human Rights Commission was the most active opponent of that law. And Tim Sow-Parmesan, some of you may know, was the Race Discrimination Commissioner and took a very public, powerful position. I want you to think about now the debates in the last few years about anti-Semitism and the role of the Human Rights Commission. Essentially, it's been hiding under the doona. Like a lot of other people, like a lot of other organisations, unable to withstand the pressure of the, I would argue, the fanatical pro-Israel lobby groups. It's occasionally made an intervention, but it should have been a voice leading us through the morass of confusion and allegation and counter-allegation and so on. It has not been able to do so. The government, I don't think, has been able to either. I don't think there's anyone in the government who's really versed in these sorts of enlightenment principles and can take a moral line, guide us the moral line through the debates between what's hate speech and what's political speech, which is really what has been going on in recent years. And so we're really lacking strong voices or institutions that are able to moderate, let alone lead the community through what are very difficult, it's been a very difficult period. Made it all the more awful when the atrocity happened at Bondi. And so that's some preface, if you like, to what I have to say about the law. And what I'm going to say about the law is that last year a judge delivered a really important judgment about anti-Semitism and the divide between unlawful anti-Semitism and political speech. And he must be feeling completely neglected because his wisdom has been completely ignored as if it didn't exist. This was a case brought against a Muslim cleric in the western suburbs of Sydney, who I think is now at the heart of inquiries about whether he was involved in inspiring the attack in Bondi. His name's Haddad. And it was a case brought by Peter Wertheim from Executive Council of Australian Jewry, and it focused on some appalling lectures that Haddad had given, which were full of gross anti-Semitism. There was no other way. It was just indefensible anti-Semitism, depicting Jews as evil, malicious, controlling the banks, controlling the world. Every shocking anti-Semitic trope was featured in the various lectures that were the subject of the case. But amongst the statements made by Haddad were also strong criticisms of the IDF, of Zionists and Zionism. And the judge upheld the case against Haddad on his sermons and found that the various horrible tropes, ridiculous abuse of Jews because they were Jewish was unlawful, but he also made clear that disparagement of Zionism constitutes disparagement of a philosophy or ideology and not a race or ethnic group. So criticising Zionism or Zionists was not unlawful. The judge also said, and I quote, "Also, political criticism of Israel, however inflammatory or adversarial, is not by its nature criticism of Jews in general or based on Jewish racial or ethnic identity. The conclusion that it is not anti-Semitic to criticise Israel is the corollary of the conclusion that to blame Jews for the actions of Israel is anti-Semitic. The one flows from the other." Now, that is an incredibly wise and accurate description of the distinction between anti-Semitism and political speech, and it's been completely ignored. Instead, the powerful lobby groups, ECAGs, the Zionist Federation and various others have relentlessly lobbied to have the IHRA definition. It's a controversial definition. The government has adopted it, the universities have adopted it, or a slightly different version of it. And various others have as well. And now the Royal Commission has adopted it, although today's comments from Virginia Bell sought to address some of the problems with that definition. The complexity with that definition is that there's a reference to criticism of Israel being able to constitute anti-Semitism if you don't apply the same standards to other countries. It's sort of a highly contentious example because there's not that many other countries at the moment that you can apply the same standard to because they're not engaged in all of the activities that Israel is engaging in. There may be, and when we were running campaigns against South African apartheid, to use an analogy, no one suggested we were all engaged in anti-Boer racism because we weren't complaining about Zimbabwe or other hotspots, China or other places in the world where human rights have been violated. So, unfortunately, the definition of the court has just been ignored in all of the debates that have been going on. And one other thing before I jump to the new legislation that's happened, is that I mentioned before that that right-wingers have swapped places on suddenly discovering a great interest in anti-racism activity, but only for Jews, and talking about safety. And one of the complexities with this issue is, or there's amongst many other complexities, is really the left created a bit of a monster when it started to use the notion of safety. When it was originally conceived of, safe spaces was about physical safety for members of the gay community in the States, US, for example, and in Australia. However, over time, it's morphed into something quite different, so that, at least in some contexts, being exposed to views you don't like or make you uncomfortable or you strongly disagree with is cited as a safety issue. That's now been weaponized very effectively by the strongest pro-Israel advocates, who will say that university protests make Jewish students feel unsafe. And the law has never really in this area dealt with feelings of unsafety, that it's dealt with objective determinations of safety, not how you feel, because I might be made to feel unsafe by something that's peculiar and that triggers me, which has no basis in rational thinking. I've got no doubt that Jewish people find criticism of Israel deeply uncomfortable. Jewish students find those protests distressing, upsetting, confronting, but I found it very elusive to understand, was there anything in this encounter or this event where there was actually a risk of something unsafe. And at the moment, that whole issue of safety is now being visited on left-wing protesters to try and silence them. Their previous incantations about microaggressions being intolerable, about safe spaces and so on, they've said, we're not interested in that anymore. We want to be able to loudly shout, Israel's engaged in genocide. We want to be macro-aggressive. So they've completely swapped places with the right. The right and the left have done an inversion here. And what that shows is it's very difficult to stick to principle when you are tribal. But it's all the more important that we have people and institutions trying to moderate that by reminding people of the principles about free speech and harm, and parliaments making considered, informed decisions about where to draw the line. Now, that brings me to talk about the lines that have been drawn. Unfortunately, as we all saw post-Bondi, the really sordid politicisation, what happened, ultimately drove the federal government to rush its legislation, which outmanoeuvred the opposition. It did well politically, but when you rush something like this, which really requires careful thought through deliberation, you don't get often very good results. And we'll see that play out over time as this legislation is enforced. But it seeks to create a group of organisations, hate groups, or to define them, and then to allow the minister to effectively to ban them. And a hate group is defined as one that publicly incites hatred or communal violence against a person or group due to their race or national or ethnic origin, not other categories of identity. And the Home Affairs Minister, to designate them as a hate group, must be satisfied they've engaged in, prepared, planned or assisted in a hate crime, which was now defined as conduct that would cause a reasonable person to be intimidated, to fear harassment or violence, or fear for their safety. So we've still got a reasonableness component, cause a reasonable person to be intimidated. To be intimidated is a tricky word. To fear harassment or violence, or fear for their safety. These are the words that lawyers and judges will pore over in the future. The new laws also criminalise advocating force or violence against specific groups as well. I would have thought that was already criminal conduct. I think what the new laws do is those say you don't have to intend that force or violence actually occur, but it's enough if you're reckless as to whether force or violence occurs. There's other offences about threatening force or violence, threatening damage or destruction of places of worship or property owned or occupied by members of a protected group. And the protected groups there include those referable to race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, and so on. And then there's mandatory minimum sentences for displaying Nazi symbols and symbols from terrorist organisations. So we'll see how this plays out, but I think the laws were rushed. Designating a group, a minister designating a group as a hate group should, I think, have more checks and balances than the current legislation allows. But again, we'll see how it plays out. And the federal government also tried to criminalise inciting genocide and racial hatred, and that did not succeed. That was interesting because that within weeks of their attempt to legislate for incitement of genocide, against incitement of genocide, the Israeli president was here as a guest of the government, who has been cited by the International Court of Justice and the United Nations for commentary which arguably incites genocide. So that put the government in a very awkward position. We've seen in New South Wales repeated new restrictions on demonstrations. There's been a crackdown criminalising displaying Nazi symbol in public, and new offences for displaying Nazi symbols near synagogues, Jewish schools, and so on. and there's a new criminal offence for intentionally and publicly inciting racial hatred. Now, what that does, when I talked about there being already laws about racial hatred and racial discrimination, they're under civil provisions. The Race Discrimination Act is a civil provision. The New South Wales government law now effectively criminalises such conduct and makes it more of a police matter as well. In Queensland, you may have heard, there's now a bill before Parliament, and amongst other things, it will allow the government to ban certain protest slogans, and it makes it an offence to use an expression in a way that might reasonably be expected to cause a member of the public to feel menaced, harassed, or offended. And they intend to ban two phrases, from the river to the sea, and globalise the Intifada. That's legislation which I think is dangerous, regressive, and anti-democratic. People will argue about what those phrases mean. If they were clearly unlawful, they would have already been pursued under the Race Discrimination Act. There would have been cases brought against people chanting those slogans if they were unlawful. They're not unlawful because I don't think they qualify as inciting, as racial vilification or inciting racial hatred or race discrimination. So we've got, I think, further restrictions on protest activity, which are unfortunate and anti-democratic, and I think the scenes in New South Wales were appalling as well. And we've got, I think, a lot of problems with an expansion of the notion of anti-Semitism, attempts to expand the parameters of what really anti-Semitism is about, to encapsulate slogans or criticisms of the conduct of Israel at a time where, in my view, it's behaved atrociously, and where it's legitimate political speech to campaign against it, just in the way it was legitimate to campaign against apartheid during the apartheid era in South Africa. So it's a really difficult time, and then we come along to the Royal Commission, and we will see what a fairly wise judge, at least we've got a very wise judge in the box at the Royal Commission, what she's going to do in this sphere. But having said that, I think the culture we're in at the moment is we're seeing a retreat from some really important democratic protections and principles, a corrosion of notions of democratic norms. That's been going on since at least 2008, when what's called the democratic recession started in different parts of the world. And although we've tried to think Australia is going to be immune, it's not. And we have some protections, but they're not going to be enough to withstand some of the pressures that are now bearing down on our culture, and I think undermining democracy. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josh.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah.
Jana, can I put a question? Josh, can you just elaborate a bit more on those pressures? So I hadn't heard the 2008 milestone of the state of decline, but how do you view that?
Well, look, I think in the book I say the rise of corporate power has produced a second Gilded Age. That is a we've seen that has triggered inequality in different parts of the world. Corporations now wield way too much power and aren't properly regulated by the state. and the inequality they produced is producing this incredible instability. At the same time, that instability has been seized on by the right, who've been very adept at moving away from some neoliberal positionings to authoritarian and populist right-wing politics, and are driving attacks on democracy that are global now. And so One Nation is working alongside Nigel Farage and global right-wing alliances, funded by second Gilded Age billionaires, to undermine all the institutions, that media, the notion of fact is now being undermined. Social media, which has produced, amazing changes, has also produced enormous harm, and we have not even begun to try and properly regulate the harm caused by those social media monopoly. We've got the commissioner, whose name I forget now, Julie Inman Grant, trying various things, but their power is immense, and social media has corroded our culture. It's corroded respect for Enlightenment values, corroded really a sense of community, driven us into warring tribes, where it's very difficult for families to sit around and talk about politics at festival time. So I think the onslaught, we're in a period of retreat from democracy, and to challenge it, we need somehow to challenge the power of corporations and right-wing populism. And the left is really struggling to do that.
Thanks, Josh. Can we take some questions and then pass over to Janet? Are there any questions that people have a burning desire to? No? In which case, Janet, over to you.
Right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen.
We can see that.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is what we do about it within the limitations of what we can do. And obviously education is going to be critical. In teaching about these things, we have to be absolutely certain that we're talking about universal values, not talking about any special groups. And in an education sector which is very severely broken up into silos of tribes, we've got to somehow cover that. And so what we're thinking about is something in the Act or coming out of the Royal Commission where all schools in Australia of all faiths should ideally on the 10th of December each year devote a couple of hours to teaching something about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because it's all there. And this is, of course, a big moment for Labor because of this man and what he did. So just to give you the atmosphere.
After World War II, it was clear that the horrors of the war should never be allowed to occur again. Founded in 1945, the United Nations sought to prevent future atrocities by affirming, in its foundational charter, faith in fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of the human person, and a commitment to promote better standards of life in larger freedom. In the years that followed, member states of the United Nations strived to develop the human rights provisions of the Charter and capture them in a single document. It took 3 years to agree on a common vision. On the 10th of December, 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations.
Still, it is the first step in a great evolutionary process. is the first occasion on which the organised community of nations has made a declaration of human rights and fundamental freedoms. It has the authority of the body of opinion of the United Nations as a whole. And millions of people, men and women and children all over the world, will turn for hope and guidance and inspiration to this document.
While history alone can determine the historic significance of an event, it is safe to say that the declaration before us may be destined to occupy an honorable place in the procession of positive landmarks in human history.
The Declaration consists of a preamble and 30 articles, with Article 1 powerfully proclaiming that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. No discrimination, right to life, liberty and security, no slavery, no torture or cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, equal protection of the law, no arbitrary arrest, detention or exile, fair and public hearing, no arbitrary interference with privacy, right to freedom of movement, right to seek and enjoy asylum, right to a nationality, right to marry and to found a family, right to property, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of peaceful assembly and association, right to take part in government, right to work, right to rest and leisure, right to food, clothing, housing, medical care, and social services, right to education, right to participate in cultural life.
These human rights are not country specific. They are not a reward for good behavior or particular to a certain era or social group. They are the rights of people of every color, from every race and ethnic group, whether or not they have disabilities, citizens or migrants, no matter their sex, their class, their caste, their creed, their age, or sexual orientation.
The Declaration has generated action for human rights protection in many ways. It has inspired hundreds of human rights instruments that together constitute international human rights law and a number of international bodies and mechanisms for human rights protection. The principles of the Declaration have supported the decolonization struggle and have been enshrined in the constitutions of the newly established countries which have joined the United Nations. The Declaration has inspired national and regional human rights protection systems, including legislation and institutions, and it continues to guide the work of human rights defenders and advocates worldwide. Today, the Declaration is available in more than 500 languages and dialects, and it has obtained the Guinness World Record for the most translated document in the world. The 10th of December, the day on which the Declaration was adopted, is celebrated each year as Human Rights Day. The Declaration emphasizes the relevance of human rights in our daily lives.
Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world.
Okay, so as it's indicated, if you're teaching this in schools, you've got to provide some context. And so that this Declaration of Human Rights in the United Nations itself came out of the extraordinary industrial destruction of World War II. And we have not in the past actually included Asia as being an equal victim. But when you look at civilian deaths across the whole of Eurasia and through Southeast Asia, we're looking at up to 55 million civilians and up to 25 million combatants. The Soviet Union and China suffered the highest casualties, almost the same as each other, with absolutely millions of civilian deaths. People were subjected to slavery, enforced labour, torture, persecution, sexual abuse. In fact, every single human right that's in the Declaration was violated. And so it represented, for all those who go on about Western civilization, a complete collapse of civilization. So one of the things, and Maureen will come on in a minute to talk, she showed that this graph of just how many died, civilians and combatants in each country, and the burden that placed on their populations. You'll see that Poland had an extraordinary loss of its people, getting up to about 19% of the whole population. Lithuania, small population, but an incredible proportion of their people. And so on. You can see here what a catastrophe it was, and apparently the children were extremely interested in this. If we're looking at how we do it in schools, each conceptual group in the Declaration has an historical context. So students can hear about slavery. They don't, I mean, it still happens, but the story of slavery, so much about, and we're talking about liberty, is from having people own you, own your body, own your mind. And so the concept of not owning yourself is something that needs to be taught. Equality before the law, which is the great hallmark of English freedom. And it goes back to the Anglo-Saxons. It's before the Normans. So it's the one big thing that the English actually brought. And we have seen it this week, of course, with Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and now Peter Mandelson, not able to escape the force of the law, whereas obviously Donald Trump still can. And you can talk in the Australian context about convicts were not like slaves. Convicts had legal rights. They had the right to a fair trial. They had a right to trial by jury for a major crime. They were presumed innocent, and they were meant to be rehabilitated and only punished as secondary punishments for offences within the system. Then if we're going to talk about freedom, there's also freedom from hunger, disease, homelessness, ignorance and poverty, the 5 great freedoms that Lord Beveridge talked about in 1944. There's a right to proper wages, safe working conditions, respect at work. All of this can come into, now the Liberals won't like it, but this is what needs to be there and they're right. And to be able to organise politically and belong to a union, a right that Australians had from the 1850s. That's something we had the right to be in a union and to strike 20 years before Britain. If we go to the first article, which we've been through, and there's a number of thoughts that I think we would want to develop, is that, and please forgive the fact that the masculine gender is used for the universal representation of people, is just that English doesn't possess a third gender like German. So we just have to put up with brotherhood, but in my generation, I always understood it to include women as well. So reason and conscience, brotherhood and solidarity. And the thing about reciprocity is absolutely critical. And so that brings us to something we can do in this multicultural country, is that the invocation that individuals are called to act towards one another with mutual respect, as stated in the text, in a spirit of brotherhood, in inverted commas. It's reciprocity, it's the golden rule, and every single major religion on earth has that as its core belief. Whether we go from Rabbi Hillel before the time of Christ, saying, do unto your neighbour as you'd have them do unto you, and all the rest of the Torah is merely commentary. You can start with him. Islam is threaded through, and you could see it in the statement yesterday that Alan Ahmed was making about the thoughts and what he said to Javed as he was tackling him, and the intense morality of believing Muslims in the way they treat each other and the depth of their generosity and so on. The Sikhs, similarly, are showing us all up. Every time there's a disaster, they get up to Lismore before the army, before the rescue operations. They're up there cooking for people. And right through all the world's religions, there is this core, and it's absolutely there in Aboriginal Indigenous thought, around all of which is to do learning how to be a good human being and how to live well with others and with the natural world. So that's the core of all religions. And I wouldn't have thought when I was much younger that I would live to see a time when religion had resurfaced to become the critical divider around the globe. It has become vicious, it has become destructive, and it is totally contrary to the fundamental tenets of all the world's religions, of this golden rule: do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. So that's a universal unifying concept that I think can work in schools. The schools we're talking about will have an extraordinary mixture of children. And the thing about Australia is that we've been forged by immigration, and especially since World War II, that has meant we've been forged by war. And that a very large number of the people who come here as refugees or even as immigrants have come here because there's been war behind them, driving them. Their world has been broken up through conflict and oppression, and they're trying to get out and to have some freedom and a better life. That means that within our community, there are people living side by side whose relatives are at war with each other overseas. As it was after World War II, where the Holocaust survivors found themselves on ships with people who had been from Lithuania or Latvia and had been in the SS. And so we've always had to live with people who once were our enemies, and that continues. And I was very moved by Nikki Sava saying how she understood how Aboriginal people could not face going to an Australia Day ceremony because she, as a Greek Cypriot, has many Turkish friends. Many of her best friends are Turkish, and she works with them and gets on with them very well. But she could not go to a national celebration day for Turkey. Just couldn't do it. So people are carrying that sort of pain from their family histories, and at the moment it's being reinforced for various communities. So in the climate of the federal electorate of wills, as Peter Khalil fought valiantly to hold on to the seat, with extreme demonstrations coming from the Greens and the Socialists, there were people who have lost family in this latest conflict in the Middle East, from Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and obviously from Israel. So in Peter's remit amongst his constituents, there were families from every side of those conflicts who had lost family. Now, that's the reality of modern Australia. How do we enable people to live with each other? And we've done it very well up till now. We must not let that go. And I think it's a very important job of Labor to be promoting that, and that we can do this in schools in a non-sectarian way. We have to remind our religious zealots amongst the Christians that Australia has always been a secular country. That's why it's been possible for Catholics to go into Parliament, to become Prime Minister, to become a judge. That's why Jews are free. We're always free to be in Parliament and become judges. None has become a Prime Minister yet. But we had our first Governor General in 1931, and the King George V went ballistic. You can't have a Jew as Governor General stand in place of the monarch. Well, we did it, and Scullin said yes. And Scullin was the first Catholic PM. The first baptised Catholic to become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was Boris Johnson, which is like having Henry VIII as the founder of your church. So we treasure that secularism, and that's the fundamental basis of freedom, that we do not have a religious state. Otherwise, you'd all be obliged to be Anglicans if you wanted to go into Parliament. So I just will stop sharing there, and I'm going to ask Maureen to switch on. Are you there?
Yes.
Hello, hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're fine.
Oh,
Far
good.
away. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. My name's Maureen O'Flaherty. I'm a teacher at Footscray High School. And at the moment, I teach year 7 and 8 humanities. And these are students that are aged 12 to 14. And the curriculum that we're given is we have to discuss democracy, Australian government, and the notion of citizenship. So there's, as you'd expect, you have to look at the structures of government and how we run elections and electorates. But at the beginning, of course, we talk about what it means to be a citizen. What is a good citizen, who you admire as a citizen, both locally and internationally. And students have done that. And then we talk about what are governments for, what are governments about, what is their purpose, and especially what is a democratic government. And I thought, and Janet and I discussed it to some extent, that one really good way to sort of introduce the notion of laws and making laws, as well as how the process of doing it, would be to look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I've just started doing. So I'm not that far along, but the students, quite enjoy it. They're enjoying it. They're getting that it's not just a dry thing where you're looking at the structures of government, but it's about them and what it all means. So they were particularly interested in the graph, or what I did with the way I introduced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was to say it came out of the atrocities of World War II, and all students are given a copy of the Universal Declaration of Rights. And we also looked, but highlighting the fact that it came out of the atrocities, and in order to actually demonstrate that, the graph you saw previously with the deaths from various countries, both civilian and military, they got it. That was something that they could understand. For a start, they didn't really understand, or they hadn't realised what it meant, World War II. The number of deaths over. So that was sort of a lesson to them. And then the notion of, of course, you introduce what we've been talking about, what it means to be not just a member of a tribe, but to be a member of the human race, and therefore to have laws or a universal understanding of what it means to be human and what are human rights. So I'm not that far along, but I sort of believe the students are interested, and I think it's really important, particularly in the light of people being pitched against one another, one group being pitched against another. And if we can sort of say we've got a commonality, and it's so much better if we can respect one another rather than blame one another. So that's what I'm doing, and I'll keep going along for another few weeks and let you know how it all pans out if you like. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maureen. Peter, do you want to go back and see if we've got questions? People
Yes.
want to say
I'm looking for people who are not in the darkness, who want to put their hand up for any question. I've just put a personal comment in there in the chat to say we are a secular state, but if you look at the Royal Commission preamble, it talks about Charles III, by the grace of God, King of Australia. So, and he's head of the Church of England, of course. So we are not secular, but somehow the King of Australia is the head of the Church of England.
Yeah, but the Church of England isn't our established church. That's the point. You see, if you're established church, you couldn't go to university until 1829 unless you signed the 33 Articles of the Church of England.
And he has no conflict of interest in the two, I'm sure. But
No.
It looks like there are no questions. But if I can say, a big thank you to Josh. That was really very educational, and I think we have work to do. So I think we've got nothing less at stake here than the state of our democracy and the state of our party. we're on the right side of history, and we really do have to hold on to multiculturalism and democracy, for heaven's sake. But I will sign off on that, Janet. And
Sonny Stevens has got a comment.
Okay, Sonny.
Yes. Steph and I, my daughter and I, have been to 4 branch meetings already this year. We've tried to get around our Gippsland area, and the theme that keeps coming up is better arming our volunteers to address issues at polling places, and most particularly pre-poll booths. So a lot of the content tonight, I think, certainly informs me on some of the tools that we might be able to equip our people with to have a respectful conversation with some of those people. You know, it won't work for all, but you know how it goes. I mean, you can, but we have to give our people some tools to go to polling places with and give them the confidence to be able to have conversations with difficult people. So certainly the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I can see already that there are some excellent articles there that can be pulled out and put into a 1 or 2 page prompt sheet to help people have conversations. So thank you for this. The content was excellent.
Okay. And then Mark Darcy.
Well, can I just butt in? Labour Academy will start next month a series of workshops that we hope to spread around the state, where we're putting together our list of 100 plus reasons to vote Labour again, but also with that cheat sheets or tip sheets, or they call them more genteel in South Australia, talking points, where you go have difficult issues and you give a script to help people talk about politics. So we'll be doing that from next month onwards. Sorry, Mark Darcy from here.
I just wanted to, and thank you. I've just found this incredibly useful, and I want to thank you all for the information that you provided. But one of the things that has always struck me is when we talk about free speech, we also need to talk about fair speech, because it's about who actually gets a voice, who actually gets listened to. And a lot of the people who complain about not having free speech are people like Andrew Bolt, who's got a platform that goes to hundreds, thousands of people, and it's about, I think we need to actually also think about fair speech and who gets access to being heard.
Good one.
Any other
Yes, just one more comment about the personal nature of the comments that are made to our volunteers. So they're often personally assaulted. So words that wound, part of the heading for this session now, is in fact, critical part for us to be thinking about how to address and how to get the conversation away from it being personal and getting it back onto political speak, not personal, not insulting me because I dared to stand on a polling place and hand out for the Labor Party.
Yeah.
All right. Or because I'm too short, or because I'm, whatever it might be, even though I am.
Yes. Well, Janet, I think we're done.
I think we're done. Can I thank you, Peter, first of all, then I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, no. Look, I think it's terrific to have on whatever night it is, a Tuesday night, 35 people participating. Thank you for your thoughtfulness. There's a lot to go away with. Again, thanks to Josh. As always, thanks to Janet, Maureen, and thank you for your attendance and your good and exceptional behaviour. Thank you all.